What kind of world creates soldiers who march into artillery fire without hesitation, who wear gas masks like a second skin, and who treat survival not as a right, but almost as a clerical error? The Death Korps of Krieg are some of the most recognizable soldiers in all of Warhammer 40,000. They look like the final memory of the First World War, dragged thousands of years into a nightmare future. But their legend is not just about trenches, bayonets, and massed bombardments. It begins with a betrayal so absolute that an entire planet chose to destroy itself rather than surrender its idea of loyalty. And by the end of this story, the men and women of Krieg will make a terrible kind of sense. To understand the Death Korps, you have to begin with Krieg itself, a world whose very name now sounds like a warning. In the Imperium of Man, Krieg is known as a death world and as a hive world, though in truth, it is unlike the teeming industrial giants that many imagine when they hear that term. It is a planet defined by ash, ruin, radiation, and duty. It supplies one thing better than almost any other world in the Imperium: soldiers. Not flamboyant heroes in gilded armor, not genetically altered demigods. Soldiers in greatcoats, rebreathers, and mud, trained to endure attrition on a scale that would break almost anyone else. That reputation was not inherited, it was forged. Krieg did not simply produce a military culture over time. It was violently remade by civil war, atomic fire, generations of underground survival, and a state religion of repentance. The Death Korps are not famous because they are merely disciplined. Many Imperial regiments are disciplined. They are famous because they seem to have gone beyond fear, beyond comfort, and almost beyond selfhood. They fight with a grim fatalism that is both terrifying and, in its own way, deeply tragic. In the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium, countless worlds raise regiments for the Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard. Some produce cavalry, some produce jungle fighters, some produce mechanized troops. Krieg produces siege regiments and line infantry, designed for prolonged wars of attrition. Their commanders understand losses the way accountants understand columns of numbers. Their troops are conditioned from birth to believe that their lives are owed to the Emperor. Every order is accepted. Every assault is prosecuted. Every sacrifice is expected. To outsiders, this can look like fanatical courage. Sometimes it is, but it is also the result of a collective history of guilt. Long ago, Krieg was not the blasted nightmare it is today. It was a loyal and prosperous world of the Imperium, notable for heavy industry and hive cities. Its output mattered. Its manpower mattered. Like many imperial worlds, it was built on hierarchy, labor, and obedience, held together by the distant authority of terror and the near authority of local rulers. But the Imperium is a vast and decaying empire, and distance breeds corruption as readily as rebellion. In time, Krieg's ruling elite became divided. Political rot deepened. Secessionist sentiment grew among powerful factions who no longer wished to submit fully to imperial control. This was not unusual in the broad history of the Imperium. Planetary governors and aristocracies often dreamed of autonomy, especially on worlds rich enough to sustain themselves. What made Krieg different was the scale of the betrayal and the response it provoked. The world's governor at the time of the Great Crisis was Colonel Jerton, a name remembered with equal parts reverence and horror. Jerton was a commander of the planetary defense forces and one of the last men on Krieg who remained absolutely loyal to the Emperor when much of the planet's leadership fell into rebellion. The rebels in Krieg were not a minor insurgency. They were numerous, entrenched, and backed by substantial military resources. When civil war erupted, it quickly became clear that the loyalists were outnumbered and outmatched in a conventional struggle. Entire hives, industrial zones, and command structures had gone over to the secessionists. Jerton faced the possibility that Krieg would be lost to the Imperium, not through invasion by alien or heretic outsiders, but through its own pride. From his perspective, that was intolerable. Better a dead world than a traitor world. Better ashes than apostasy. That logic is the key to everything that follows. In Warhammer 40,000, loyalty is not simply political, it is sacred. To betray the Imperium is to betray the God Emperor himself. It is spiritual treason as much as military rebellion. Jurton believed that if Krieg could not be saved by ordinary means, then it had to be cleansed by extraordinary ones. He turned to the one arsenal still fully under his control, the planet's stockpiles of atomic weapons. The decision he made would define Krieg forever. Rather than allow the secessionists to keep their cities and industries, Jurton ordered a nuclear holocaust across the planet's surface. Missiles fell, cities vanished in fire, continents were poisoned, the atmosphere became a killer. Vast portions of Krieg were transformed into radioactive wasteland. The Loyalists suffered alongside the rebels. There was no clean separation. Jurton was not preserving his own people while destroying the enemy. He was sentencing the entire world to generations of ruin in order to deny victory to traitors. This is why the story of Krieg is so unsettling. It is not simply one of noble resistance. It is one of absolute conviction taken to apocalyptic extremes. Jurton's act is remembered in imperial histories as an expression of incorruptible loyalty. And within the moral universe of the Imperium, it was. But to modern ears, and even to many within the setting, it is impossible not to hear the cost. Billions died. The world was broken. Civilization on the surface collapsed into a wasteland of poisoned dust and shattered concrete. Yet for the Imperium, the measure that mattered most was that Krieg did not remain in rebel hands. What survived did so beneath the surface. Deep bunker complexes, fortified shelters, sealed military installations, and underground production centers became the womb of a new Krieg. Jurton and the Loyalists retreated into these depths and prepared for a war that would not last months or years, but generations. Imagine what that means culturally. Entire populations raised with no memory of blue sky. Children born into vaults under a dead world, taught from infancy that they existed to atone for the sins of their ancestors. Industry rebuilt in claustrophobic darkness. Military doctrine refined around one assumption: the war must continue until the traitors are gone, no matter how long it takes. And continue it did. The civil war on Krieg lasted for centuries. In some accounts, more than 500 years passed between Jurton's nuclear purging of the surface and the final Loyalist victory. 5 centuries of siege lines, assaults, counterattacks, tunneling, bombardment, and subterranean endurance. Most worlds would not survive such a conflict in any meaningful sense. Krieg survived by becoming something narrower and harder than a normal society. It became a machine for war and repentance. The descendants of the Loyalists were not raised as ordinary civilians who might one day become soldiers. On Krieg, the distinction all but vanished. Social identity centered on service. Life was regimented. Obedience was sanctified. The sins of the past were taught as a hereditary burden. Their forebears had allowed rebellion to flourish. Therefore their own lives were forfeit until that stain had been repaid in blood and loyalty. It is one of the bleakest cultural transformations in the Imperium, because it takes a population already trapped in misery and convinces them that misery is morally appropriate, while the traitor remnants clung to their hidden strongholds and ruins across the planet. Blasted surface. The Loyalists adapted to the conditions of total environmental collapse. Gas masks, rebreathers, sealed uniforms, and hardened trench systems became necessities, not stylistic choices. The popular image of the Death Korps in long coats and skull-faced masks emerges from these conditions. The atmosphere of Krieg was toxic. Dust, ash, and radiation made exposed life precarious. Warfare, under such conditions, naturally favored heavy fortification, carefully maintained supply lines, engineering units, and the ability to absorb losses while pressing incremental offensives. Over generations, the techniques of siege warfare became embedded in the culture as much as in the army. Earthworks, saps, redoubts, artillery registration, pre-planned bombardment, careful timing between barrages and infantry waves. The Death Korps would become famous for all of this later in Imperial service, but its roots were practical before they were doctrinal. On Krieg, there were enemy fortifications to be reduced, contaminated ground to cross, and a world of ruined cities where every meter had to be paid for. There is another important dimension to Krieg's transformation, and that is population. A war lasting centuries consumes lives at a rate no normal demographic system can easily support, especially on a dead world. Krieg is known in later eras for its extraordinary ability to produce replacement troops in huge numbers. Imperial scholars and fans alike often point to the use of vitae wombs and other highly controlled methods of reproduction and population management associated with the world's militarized society. However one imagines the exact processing daily life, the result is clear. Krieg became intensely focused on maximizing human output for the war effort. Birth, upbringing, education, and deployment were all subordinated to military need. This gives the Death Korps one of their most unsettling qualities. They do not feel like a society that has an army. They feel like an army that still technically has a society attached to it. Every institution bends toward producing obedient fighters. Every value reinforces sacrifice. If another regiment from another world might speak of home in sentimental terms, a trooper of Krieg speaks of duty. Their home taught them that the purpose of birth is to pay a debt to the emperor. Even their stoicism is not merely personal temperament. It is civilizational training. As the long civil war ground onward, the loyalists slowly gained the advantage. Their discipline, central command, and apocalyptic resolve wore down the secessionists. What matters here is not only that they won, but how. Victory did not arrive as a glorious breakthrough or a heroic final battle with triumphant banners. It came through attrition, through the reduction of one traitor pocket after another, through endurance measured in generations, through a refusal to stop. This is the essence of Krieg in military form. Not brilliance in maneuver, not romance in battle. Persistence, sharpened into a weapon. Eventually, the loyalists reclaimed the planet. The traitors were exterminated. Krieg was returned to the Imperium, at least in the technical sense that mattered to the Administratum and the Departamento Munitorum. But the world that rejoined the wider Imperium was not the one that had rebelled. It was a scarred remnant, inhabited by descendants of bunker populations, trained under a theology of penitence and war. The surface remained lethal. The culture remained severe. The memory of treachery remained alive. And perhaps most importantly, Krieg's rulers and commanders had learned that absolute sacrifice won the day. From that point forward, Krieg's tithe to the Imperium became one of manpower. The world was required to provide troops to the Astra Militarum, and it did so with grim enthusiasm. If there was a debt to be paid for the ancient rebellion, then every regiment exported off-world was a further installment. This is why the Death Korps are often described not only as soldiers, but as penitents. They do not simply fight for the Imperium in the way Cadian or Katakan troops might. They fight to redeem Krieg itself. This helps explain the strange relationship that other Imperial forces have with them. On the one hand, the Death Korps are admired. They are reliable under the worst imaginable conditions. They dig in fast. They attack when ordered. They hold when others might break. Their artillery is disciplined. Their engineers are invaluable. Their willingness to absorb casualties can turn impossible operations into merely horrific ones. In a galaxy where commanders are often asked to take fortified worlds, suppress heresies, or resist invasions at any cost, such troops are priceless. On the other hand, many find them disturbing. Officers from other worlds may be unnerved by how little concern Kriegers show for survival. Commissars, whose role in many regiments is to stiffen resolve and suppress cowardice, sometimes find themselves with very little to do among the Death Korps. a Krieg soldier is not likely to flee. The more difficult problem is often ensuring they do not seek death too readily in the name of duty. That trait is useful up to a point, but war still requires judgment, logistics, and preservation of combat power. A dead soldier cannot hold tomorrow's trench. Yet Krieg's culture leans toward the belief that dying in service is the purest fulfillment of existence. It is important not to turn that into a cartoon. The Death Korps are not mindless. They are capable soldiers, often highly skilled, especially in siegecraft, field engineering, artillery coordination, and defensive warfare. Their officers can be competent and methodical. Their cavalry units have shown aggression and mobility. Their engineers understand demolitions and breaching operations. Their quartermasters and logistic structures are efficient in the specific, brutal way siege armies must be. They are not suicidal in the simplistic sense of charging pointlessly for no reason. Rather, they operate with a lower valuation of individual life and a higher tolerance for attrition than most other human forces. Their equipment reflects this identity. The iconic greatcoat protects against harsh conditions and offers practical utility in trench environments. The gas mask or respirator, whether strictly necessary on every battlefield or not, is part survival gear, part inherited tradition from their poisoned home. Their helmets and armor often have a severe, almost archaic quality, visually evoking industrial age warfare, which only deepens their haunted reputation. Their forces rely heavily on artillery, heavy mortars, earthshaker cannon, entrenching tools, and armored support suited to smashing fortified lines rather than dancing around them. In many depictions of Imperial Guard warfare, the line between historical inspiration and futuristic exaggeration is very clear. With Krieg, the influence of First World War imagery is impossible to miss. Trenches stretching to the horizon, waves of infantry advancing behind barrages, mud, smoke, wire, shell craters, and masks. But the 40K version turns the dial far beyond history. These are not campaigns fought for months. They can last decades. The artillery is larger. The casualties are more obscene. The enemies might be rebels, orcs, heretics, Xenos horrors, or demonic infestations. And the psychological environment is more absolute, because the Imperium frames all conflict in religious and existential terms. That combination is one reason the Death Korps are so enduringly compelling as a part of 40K lore. They are instantly legible. You see them and understand almost at once that these are humanity's trench ghosts. But then the deeper lore adds layers. They are not merely grim because war is grim. They are grim because their entire planetary identity was built around inherited guilt. Never forgave itself. Their stoicism is not only battlefield professionalism, it is ritualized atonement. Their attitude toward command is similarly shaped. In the Death Korps, duty to the chain of command is central. Orders are to be fulfilled. Hesitation is shameful. Initiative exists, but usually within a framework of disciplined execution rather than flamboyant heroics. This makes them exceptionally suited to large, coordinated offensives where timing and mass matter more than individual glory. It also means they can seem emotionally distant, even by Imperial standards. Many Krieg soldiers are terse, formal, and difficult for outsiders to read. Their masks conceal expression, and their culture discourages personal display. Individuality is submerged beneath function. Names and identity themselves can take on a muted quality in Krieg formations, depending on the source and depiction. Troopers are often associated more strongly with rank, role, or serial designation than with the vibrant personal histories common in more character-driven regiments. This does not mean they are literal clones of personality. It means the culture presses hard against self-expression. If your life exists to repay a debt, then being memorable as an individual is not the point. Being useful is. One of the great showcases for the Death Korps in Imperial military history is the Siege of Vrax, a campaign that did much to cement their image among fans. Vrax was a protracted siege and war of attrition against renegades and later chaos-corrupted defenders on the fortress world of Vrax. It was exactly the kind of hellish operation for which Krieg had been preparing, culturally and doctrinally, for generations. Trenches, artillery duels, fortified lines, mining operations, repeated assaults, and appalling casualties defined the campaign. If Krieg had a signature performance, Vrax was close to it. During the siege, the Death Korps demonstrated both their strengths and their costs. They could prosecute a long campaign without losing cohesion. They could maintain pressure. They understood how to grind down layered defenses. Their engineers and artillery were central to operations. But the campaign also underlined how horrifying attritional war really is. Gains were often measured in devastated ground and shattered positions rather than clean strategic elegance. Men died in extraordinary numbers. Entire formations could be consumed to reduce strongpoints. In that environment,